The restaurant was full, with laughter and the clink of glasses filling the stuffy air. I, standing at the entrance, scanned the tables for her. The letter he held in his hand shook slightly, but not with nervousness, but with contained anger. There she was, at a table lit by a candle, next to a man who gestured exaggeratedly while she smiled, that smile that I always thought was just mine. The previous weeks had been a blur of doubts and contradictions. Her every gesture seemed programmed, an extra delicacy in her touches, spontaneous smiles that seemed forced, and nights when her attention, despite being physical, seemed to be elsewhere. I wasn't naive, but I also wasn't prepared for the impact of confirmation. An anonymous call. A photo sent to my phone. She getting out of that man's car. All the pieces fell into place with an almost poetic cruelty, and there I was, just a few meters away from facing the outcome I had been silently planning. My footsteps seemed to echo on the marble floor as I crossed the room. The distance between us closed, but each step made the weight in my hands more unbearable. When I stopped in front of the table, they both looked up at me. He, confused, tried to understand who I was. She, pale as paper, stood frozen. It was no surprise, it was fear. I knew that I knew. "Read it," he said, handing her the letter. My voice sounded low, but each word was like a hammer. "That's what a traitor deserves." His eyes, once full of charm for him, filled with tears. She tried to speak, but the words were choked. He, clearly uncomfortable, began to stand up, as if he wanted to defend something. I don't know if it was her honor or her own dignity, but it didn't matter. My look was enough to crush any attempt at bravery. "Do you know what it says?" I asked, now looking at the man. My voice gained an intensity that seemed to make the entire restaurant go silent. "It's the end. For her. For you. For us." The silence around us was so thick that it was possible to hear the muffled sound of ambient music. He looked at her, as if waiting for some explanation, but she just lowered her head. There were no justifications that could alleviate what was happening. Not for him, not for me, not for anyone watching that spectacle. My hands were steady. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control. But the pain still pulsed. A part of me wanted to scream, to break that perfect scenario of betrayal with a gesture of fury, but another part knew that was unnecessary. Her humiliation was already complete, and he didn't know it yet, but destiny would have something in store for him. "I hope you enjoy dinner," I said, turning to leave. But before taking the last step, I turned around again and added, "Oh, and don't worry. You will understand what betrayal really is." The walk to the exit was a blur. I could feel the eyes burning into my back. Some tables whispered, others pretended not to notice. But the world seemed to be in slow motion, as if that moment was a milestone in my life. And, indeed, it was. The end of something I thought was eternal, replaced by something much darker. As I drove home, memories came like gusts of wind, each one more painful than the last. The moments we had together, the promises, the plans. Everything reduced to a cruel joke. However, even amidst the storm of emotions, an idea began to take shape. They thought they could fool me, make a fool of me, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. When I got home, the darkness of the room seemed to reflect my state of mind. I opened a bottle of wine and sat on the couch, staring into space. It wasn't sadness he felt, but cold determination. She not only destroyed what we had, but she did it in a calculated way. And he, the man who decided to get involved with a married woman, had his own scores to settle. As I took a sip, I began mentally plotting my next steps. It would not be an obvious or immediate revenge. It would be meticulous. It needs. They wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. I had the tools and knowledge to do this. It wouldn't just be about making the case, it would be about destroying the foundations that supported the lives they thought they had so carefully built. The messages started arriving on my phone later that night. She, begging to talk. He, with a threatening tone, as if he could intimidate someone. I ignored both. They didn't deserve answers, not yet. There was something much bigger at stake now. The next day, work began. First, social media. A leaked photo here, an insinuating comment there. Nothing that could be traced back to me, but enough to plant seeds of doubt in their circles. Then, professional contacts. Finding out where he worked was easy, and all it took was an anonymous email to launch an internal investigation that would put his position at risk. With her, it was even simpler. Every detail of her life was in my hands, and I knew exactly how to use them. As the weeks passed, the results began to appear. He missed out on an important promotion, and rumors began to circulate about her work. The two of them were still together, trying to navigate the storm I had created, but they wouldn't last long. It was a matter of time before they started blaming each other, until the facade completely crumbled. I watched from afar, with a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Their betrayal had destroyed me, but at the same time, it had transformed me. And now, as I watched their lives fall apart, one question remained: how far was I willing to go? Welcome to the channel where betrayal will never be tolerated. Here, we tell fictional stories that show how infidelity can destroy lives, families, and trust. Our goal is to bring powerful and impactful reflections on the consequences of wrong choices. Get ready, because now you will hear a shocking story that will hold your attention until the last second. Good story. Leonardo and Clara were the portrait of a couple who seemed to have found balance amidst the complexities of life. Married for almost a decade, they had built together not just a house, but a home where love seemed to be the basis of everything. Leonardo, aged 38, was a pragmatic man, but with a generous heart. Manager of a technology company, he balanced long working hours with time spent with his family, always trying to surprise Clara with small gestures that showed how important she was. Clara, in turn, was a free-spirited and creative woman. At 35, he had turned his passion for photography into a successful career, capturing moments that touched the soul. The world they shared was full of details that reflected the life they had built together. The house they shared was spacious but cozy, with walls that displayed photographs taken by Clara, chronicling trips, encounters and simple moments of happiness. The garden, taken care of on weekends by Leonardo, was a refuge where the two liked to have coffee on lazy Sunday mornings. Every corner of that space carried a memory, a story, a reflection of who they were as a couple. Behind this serene facade, however, there were tensions that, although discreet, were already casting shadows on the relationship. Leonardo had always been a predictable man, something that Clara used to admire, but which, in recent times, seemed to suffocate her. His nights were marked by routines that, despite being comfortable, had lost their former shine. Clara, on the other hand, was looking for something more. She couldn't explain what exactly, but she felt a growing emptiness, as if something essential was missing from her life, even though she was next to a man who seemed willing to move mountains for her. Leonardo's days were filled with meetings and tight deadlines, but even so, he never stopped thinking about Clara. His affectionate messages in the middle of the day and quick calls to see if she was okay were ways of reinforcing the bond that, for him, was unshakable. However, Clara, immersed in photography sessions and meetings with colleagues in the field, began to feel at a different pace, as if the two were slowly growing apart. They didn't talk about it. There was an invisible barrier that prevented them from bringing up the subject, perhaps for fear of unearthing something that could not be resolved. At dinner, they talked about banal things, the day at work, plans for the coming weekend, but avoided any mention of the feelings that were beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Leonardo believed everything was fine, while Clara hid her doubts behind smiles and encouraging phrases. That week, something seemed different about Clara. There was a sparkle in her eyes, a renewed energy that Leonardo noticed but couldn't interpret. He attributed it to Clara's success at a recent exhibition, where her photographs had received warm praise. In truth, Leonardo was proud of her, but he didn't know how to express it without seeming forced. He was a man of actions, not words, and Clara always understood that. Or at least that's what he believed. Clara, on the other hand, was torn between satisfaction with her professional projects and a restlessness that she couldn't ignore. In her photo shoots, she found herself lost in thought, imagining what it would be like to live a less planned, more instinctive life. She knew these ideas were dangerous, but she couldn't help it. Leonardo was a good man, she was sure of that, but at times it seemed that the love they shared had become too comfortable, almost anesthetic. Still, they continued their routine. Leonardo was planning a surprise trip to celebrate his wedding anniversary, something he believed would rekindle the flame that, for him, had never gone out. Clara, unaware of her husband's plans, focused her energy on a new project, but with part of her mind always wandering, questioning the paths she had not taken. One night, while they were having dinner, Clara talked about a charity dinner that would take place next week, organized by a group of artists in the city. She seemed excited, explaining how it would be an opportunity to expand her network. Leonardo, although tired, smiled and encouraged her to participate. He knew that these occasions were important to Clara, even if they didn't fully understand the world in which she moved. What he didn't know was that that dinner would mark a turning point that he could never have predicted. In the week leading up to the event, Clara seemed more distant. He spent hours on the phone, organizing details or exchanging messages with people Leonardo didn't know. He tried not to be bothered, telling himself that it was in the nature of her job. But something inside him began to bother him. A subtle but persistent feeling that something was slipping through your fingers. On the day of the dinner, Clara left early, dressed in a dress that Leonardo always loved. He praised her, but she just smiled briefly and hurried away, leaving a scent in the air that seemed as familiar as it was distant. Leonardo, in turn, stayed at home, trying to distract himself with a book, but finding it difficult to focus. Her absence felt heavier than usual. That night, while Clara was at the event, Leonardo reflected on what was happening between them. He began to wonder if there was something he wasn't seeing, if the distance he felt was real or just a figment of his imagination. He wanted to believe that everything was okay, that Clara still loved him the same way he loved her. But there was something in the back of his mind that said otherwise, a small voice that whispered doubts that he couldn't silence. As the clock ticked down, Leonardo realized that although he was trying to ignore it, there was a growing feeling that he was about to face something that would change his life forever. And in that moment, he decided he needed to know the truth, no matter what it took. That morning, Leonardo woke up with an inexplicable weight on his chest. Clara had already left, leaving only a note pinned to the refrigerator, which said that she had a series of commitments during the day and might return late. He took the paper, feeling the weight of each word, as if they hid something he couldn't identify. The last few weeks had been full of mixed signals, small gestures that didn't suit the woman he knew so well. Still, Leonardo refused to believe that anything was really wrong. Clara was his wife, his companion, the person with whom he had built a life. As he sipped his coffee, he mentally reviewed recent events. Clara seemed different, but he tried to justify that with the stress of work, with the demands of the new project. Deep down, Leonardo knew he was ignoring a growing restlessness, an inner voice that warned him that something was out of place. During the day, he immersed himself in work, but his concentration seemed to slip through his fingers. Every notification on your phone made your heart race, hoping it was a message from her, something that would dispel that feeling of uncertainty. However, hours passed without a word. At the end of the day, Leonardo decided to call Clara, but she didn't answer. He tried again, but the connection was forwarded directly to voicemail. He left a brief message, trying to hide his tone of concern. He then opened the messaging app and saw that she was last seen hours before. This made him even more uneasy. He decided to send a casual message, asking if she knew what time she would be back, but there was no response. Night fell, and the house seemed quieter than usual. Leonardo, sitting on the sofa, stared at the turned-off television while a whirlwind of thoughts consumed him. He knew it wasn't just paranoia, there was something there, something he still couldn't decipher. Then he remembered the charity dinner. Clara had talked about the event so enthusiastically, but she hadn't mentioned who she was going with or why she seemed so excited to be there. It was different from her usual behavior, always transparent with her plans and commitments. This awakened something in Leonardo, an impulse he couldn't ignore. He picked up the phone again and decided to look for information about the event. After some quick research, he found the address of the restaurant where the dinner was taking place. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was exaggerating. But the feeling that something was wrong was overwhelming. He put on a coat, grabbed his car keys and left, his head full of questions that needed answers. The path to the restaurant was covered in silence, with Leonardo alternating between anger and anguish. He tried to convince himself that he was just worrying for nothing, that he would find Clara at a table surrounded by coworkers, laughing and sharing ideas. But a part of him, the same one that had been whispering doubts for the last few weeks, knew that the reality could be very different. Upon arriving at the restaurant, Leonardo parked on a nearby street and spent a few minutes in the car, observing the movement. Well-dressed people came and went, and the muffled sound of laughter and conversation escaped through the open doors. He took a deep breath before getting out of the car, trying to calm the thoughts that insisted on creating devastating scenarios in his mind. Upon entering the restaurant, his eyes quickly swept around the room. It was a sophisticated environment, with elegantly arranged tables and lighting that created an intimate atmosphere. However, Leonardo did not care about the details, his attention was focused on finding Clara. He walked slowly, trying not to attract attention, as he searched every corner of the room. And then he saw her. Clara was sitting at a table near the window, with a man Leonardo didn't recognize. They spoke in a relaxed manner, but there was something in her body language that made Leonardo's heart sink. Clara's smile was different, more open, more genuine than he had seen in months. The man, with a charm that seemed calculated, lightly touched her hand as he spoke. The scene was disconcerting, almost surreal. Leonardo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. He tried to control himself, but the wave of emotions was overwhelming. He felt anger, sadness, humiliation, all at the same time. For a moment, he considered leaving, going home, and pretending he hadn't seen anything. But I knew that wasn't an option. He needed answers, he needed to understand what was happening. With firm steps, he approached the table, feeling every muscle in his body tense. When Clara saw him, her smile instantly disappeared. The man looked at Leonardo with a confused expression, while Clara seemed paralyzed, unable to say anything. Leonardo, with a firm voice, but full of pain, just said that he needed to talk to her. The man, still not understanding the situation, tried to intervene, but Leonardo completely ignored him. He held Clara's gaze, waiting for her to say something, anything that might explain what was happening. Clara finally stammered a few words, trying to minimize the situation, but Leonardo's expression made it clear that he was not willing to accept easy excuses. He knew that it wasn't just a casual meeting, that there was something much bigger behind that scene. Betrayal, which was once just a distant possibility, was now an undeniable reality, etched in memory like an open wound. Leonardo left the restaurant without looking back, leaving Clara and the man sitting in awkward silence. As he got into the car, he felt the first tears flow. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, it was the weight of seeing everything he believed to be solid crumble before his eyes. But as he drove home, a cold determination began to take hold of him. He knew that that night was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would completely change the course of their lives. Leonardo was sitting on the living room sofa, his head resting in his hands, his heart still racing. The silence in the house was almost unbearable, broken only by the insistent ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara's words, her images at that dinner, everything was recorded in his mind as if it were a film repeated. He tried to understand how everything had gotten to this point, but each attempt felt like a blade cutting deeper. The messages on his phone kept coming, but he ignored each one. There was nothing she could say at that moment that would erase what he saw. When he finally heard the sound of the keys in the door, a wave of conflicting emotions went through him. Anger, pain, anxiety. Clara entered the room slowly, her eyes swollen like someone who had been crying for hours. She looked like she was about to collapse, but Leonardo didn't move. He stood there, motionless, waiting for her to break the silence. Finally, she murmured his name, barely above a whisper, as if she feared that any word would make things worse. He slowly raised his head and looked at her. There was no longer that usual warmth in his gaze, just a devastating emptiness. She began to speak, stumbling over her words, trying to justify the unjustifiable. He said it wasn't what it seemed, that everything had an explanation, but Leonardo interrupted. His voice was low, but it carried a crushing weight. He wanted to know the truth, the whole truth, without beating around the bush. There was no more room for excuses or half-words. Clara hesitated, her eyes shining with tears about to fall, but he insisted, firmly, as if he depended on it to keep breathing. Then she started talking, and what he heard left him floored. Clara admitted the affair. The words came out of her like heavy stones, each one crushing what little remained between them. He said he didn't plan for that to happen, that it was something that was out of his control. She spoke of the emptiness she felt, of how she had lost herself in their routine, of how that man seemed to offer an escape, a relief from something she didn't even know how to describe. Leonardo listened to her in silence, but inside he felt torn apart. It was as if her every word was a stab, and he couldn't decide if the pain was greater due to the betrayal itself or the fact that she had felt so distant from him without him noticing. When Clara finished, the room was filled with a silence that seemed to suffocate. Leonardo finally stood up, running his hands over his face in a tired gesture. He said he needed to know everything, that he didn't want any more details hidden. Clara hesitated, but he was categorical. If she wanted to even try to save something, she would need to be completely honest. It was then that she began to talk about the secret he never expected to hear. Clara revealed that the man she had gotten involved with was not just a stranger. He was part of a circle very close to Leonardo's company, someone who, in fact, had a direct connection with the business that Leonardo had been developing for months. She said it all started as a coincidence, a casual conversation at a work event that turned into something she couldn't control. She said she never wanted it to become something so serious, but when she realized it, she was stuck in a situation she didn't know how to get out of. Leonardo listened to every word carefully, but the biggest impact came when she confessed what he had already begun to suspect. The man in question, the lover, had been using Clara not only to fill her emotional void, but also to obtain privileged information about Leonardo's business dealings. He knew exactly who Leonardo was and what he represented, and he approached Clara with the clear intention of manipulating her. She, blinded by the confused emotions she was feeling, ended up giving in and, without realizing it, handed over important details about the company's projects and strategies. Leonardo felt the floor disappear. It wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was also a betrayal that put everything he had built professionally at risk. He turned away, unable to look at her for another second. Clara tried to justify it, saying that it was never intentional, that she didn't realize what was happening until it was too late, but for Leonardo, her words were just a distant echo. He left the room, went up to the bedroom and locked himself in, leaving Clara alone with her guilt. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he tried to organize his thoughts, but everything seemed in absolute chaos. The man Clara trusted, to whom she had given not only her trust but also valuable information, was now a direct enemy. Leonardo knew he needed to act, but the weight of personal betrayal was difficult to ignore. He couldn't simply face that man on a professional level without his personal hurt boiling over. Each step would have to be calculated, each decision cold and strategic. It was a scenario he never imagined facing, but now there was no other choice. He stood up, returned to the room, and, his voice still firm, told Clara that she had destroyed not only their marriage, but also part of who he was. He said she would have to deal with the consequences of what she did, and that he would not protect her from the repercussions. Clara, crying, tried to reach him, but he backed away. He said the only thing she could do now was help him fix the damage, starting by revealing everything she knew about her lover's involvement in his business. She hesitated, but knew she had no choice. Leonardo was determined, and her betrayal had already caused too much damage. What came next would be a battle to not only regain control of her life, but also to protect herself from those who tried to use her trust as a weapon. While Clara spoke, Leonardo wrote down every detail, his mind already plotting the next steps. He knew that the confrontation with the man would come soon, and when it did, he would be prepared. Leonardo spent the night awake, sitting at the kitchen table with papers scattered around him. He frantically wrote down everything Clara had confessed, every detail that could be useful in dismantling the scheme that her lover seemed to be hatching. The silence in the house was almost unbearable, but he knew he needed to keep a cool head. The personal betrayal hurt deeply, but the threat to his work and reputation was something he couldn't ignore. Leonardo was about to face something much bigger than a crisis in his marriage. He was dealing with a direct attack on his future, the one he had worked so hard to build. The next morning, Clara found him still in the kitchen. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but Leonardo didn't show any reaction when he saw her. He just kept writing, his mind focused on the next step. She tried to speak, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. "I've heard everything I needed. Now, I need you to be useful. Tell me what else he knows." "Don't hide anything," he said, without looking directly at her. Clara took a deep breath, trying to control the tears that threatened to return. She knew she had no choice. With a hesitant voice, he began to tell details that he had omitted the night before. She talked about the questions her lover asked, always disguised as innocent curiosity, and how he seemed to know exactly what to say to make her let her guard down. Leonardo listened to everything in silence, but the tension in his jaw was evident. He felt a mixture of disgust and frustration, but he knew that, to face this, he needed to remain rational. When Clara finished, he stood up abruptly and began to tidy up the papers. He said he needed to go out to sort out some things and that he would come back later. Clara tried to insist that they talk about the wedding, but Leonardo ignored her. For him, that matter was closed, at least for now. There were much more pressing issues to be resolved. He drove directly to his lawyer's office without even calling to let them know. Upon arrival, he got straight to the point, explaining what was happening and asking for guidance on how to protect his company and its finances. The lawyer, visibly alarmed, asked for more details and began to draw up an action plan. They spent hours discussing legal strategies, identifying vulnerable points, and preparing an approach to confront the man who had caused it all. Back at the company, Leonardo called an urgent meeting with his trusted team. He did not reveal the complete reason, but made it clear that there were suspicions of information leaks and that drastic measures would need to be taken to guarantee the security of the projects. He knew he needed to act quickly. Clara's lover, in addition to being an emotional threat, was also a real risk to the stability of her business. That night, while Clara remained at home, isolated and consumed by guilt, Leonardo found the man who had caused so much damage. He waited outside the office where he knew he worked, watching his every move. When he finally saw him leave, Leonardo followed him to a nearby bar. The tension in his chest was almost unbearable, but he knew this confrontation needed to happen. As soon as the man sat down at a table, Leonardo entered and walked towards him with firm steps. Without giving time for any reaction, he pulled out a chair and sat down opposite him. The lover seemed surprised, but tried to hide it with a confident smile. "I was waiting for you to show up," said the man, in an almost challenging tone. Leonardo leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the other's. "And I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences of what you did. Because I will ensure that your every step from now on is controlled by me." You have no idea what started it. Leonardo's voice was cold, almost calculated. The man maintained his smile, but it was clear that he was uncomfortable. He tried to argue, saying it was all just a misunderstanding, but Leonardo didn't let himself be shaken. He began to lay out the details he had gathered, the connections that proved the man was using Clara to obtain information and harm his company. Every word was a direct accusation, and the once confident lover began to waver. When Leonardo finished, he stood, looking at him with contempt. This is just the beginning. I will expose you. At work, in your personal life, wherever necessary. There is no way to escape, he said before turning and leaving. When he arrived home, he found Clara sitting in the living room, waiting for him. She looked exhausted, but there was something in her expression that indicated she knew he had gone to confront the man. Leonardo didn't say anything. He walked straight past her and went up to the bedroom, leaving her alone again. In the days that followed, the consequences began to appear. Leonardo managed to limit his lover's reach in the company, but he knew that the battle was far from over. Clara tried to redeem herself in every possible way, but the relationship between them was completely shaken. Every day was a struggle for Leonardo, torn between the pain of betrayal and the need to focus on protecting what was most important to him. Despite everything, he remained determined. I knew the road would be long, but I was willing to face every obstacle. After all, what was at stake was not just his company, but also his dignity and his ability to overcome what seemed to be the worst moment of his life. Leonardo would not allow anyone, not even Clara, to destroy what he had built with so much effort. And, as he worked to get back on his feet, a new perspective began to emerge in his mind, the possibility of starting over, alone, but stronger than ever. In the days following the confrontation, Leonardo felt in a constant state of alert. His mind was always divided between emotional chaos and the need to keep a cool head to face the practical consequences. Clara's lover had been removed from any influence over the company's projects, but the emotional damage continued to pulse like an open wound. He threw himself into work, seeking refuge in rationality and in the tasks that demanded his attention, but even so, the memories of what he had discovered insisted on invading his mind. Clara remained in the house, but it was as if they were two strangers sharing the same space. Her attempts to talk were met with silence or monosyllabic responses. Leonardo knew that, at some point, he would need to face the situation, but every time he thought about sitting down to discuss the future, the pain of betrayal seemed unbearable. He couldn't separate the image of her, sitting at that dinner, from the emptiness he now felt inside himself. That night, as he looked out the window of his home office, the darkness outside seemed to reflect what he felt. The silence was heavy, but it was interrupted by the hesitant sound of Clara entering the room. He didn't turn around immediately, but he felt her presence. She stood still for a moment, trying to find the right words, before finally starting to speak. She said she knew she had destroyed something precious, that she never expected forgiveness, but she needed him to understand that she hadn't acted out of malice. He spoke about the emptiness he felt, about how he had lost himself in a routine that seemed to have consumed their relationship. Leonardo finally turned to face her. His eyes were tired, but there was a gleam of determination in them. He said he understood that she was also dealing with her own demons, but that didn't justify what she had done. His every word was measured, filled with repressed emotion, but clear as crystal. He said he couldn't just erase everything that happened, that trust, once destroyed, was almost impossible to rebuild. Clara listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, but without interrupting him. She knew he needed to say it, that those words were as much for him as they were for her. When Leonardo finished, he looked out the window again, leaving her there, without answers. Clara left the room in silence, and he remained where he was, fighting the conflicting emotions that consumed him. He felt anger, sadness, but also a strange sense of freedom, as if he was about to leave behind something that had held him back for a long time. The next morning, Leonardo received a call from his lawyer, informing him that the proceedings against his lover were progressing and that he had managed to avoid further damage to the company. It was a small victory in the midst of chaos, but enough to bring momentary relief. As he listened to the updates, he realized this was an important step toward taking back control of his life. He decided he could no longer postpone the decisions he needed to make. Later that afternoon, he asked Clara to sit with him. She seemed apprehensive, but also relieved that they were finally having an open conversation. Leonardo began by saying that he didn't see how they could continue together. It wasn't just the betrayal, that was what it had revealed about them as a couple. He said their relationship, although built on love and respect, had become something different, something that was no longer working for either of them. Clara tried to argue, saying she was willing to do anything to rebuild what they had, but Leonardo interrupted her. He didn't want to rebuild something that, for him, was irreparably broken. Clara started to cry again, but didn't insist. She knew he was right, even if accepting it was devastating. She said she loved him, that she would always love him, but that she understood that what she did was unforgivable. Leonardo listened in silence, allowing her to express what she felt, but his decision had already been made. He said she could stay in the house until she organized her things and that he would also need time to find a new place. There was no rancor in his words, just a resigned sadness. As Clara climbed the stairs, Leonardo felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but also a deep pain, as if he was saying goodbye to an important part of himself. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was the only path that made sense. He would spend the next few days focused on finding a new space to start anew, leaving behind what could no longer be fixed. Leonardo spent that night thinking about everything that had happened, about all the choices that brought them there. He was not naive enough to believe that Clara was solely to blame. I knew I had failed to notice the signs, to offer the support she needed, but I also knew that didn't justify what she had done. He decided that, from that moment on, his energy would be directed to rebuilding himself, to starting over, even if that meant facing the unknown alone. The next day, he started looking for a new place to live. During the search, he found a small apartment that seemed perfect for what he needed, a space to start over, to rebuild his life without the shadows of the past. Clara, in turn, began packing her bags, moving through the house like a ghost, silent but clearly struggling with her own regrets. They both knew that this was the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new, something they still needed to discover. As Leonardo closed the contract for the new apartment, he felt a sense of relief. It wasn't happiness, but a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew there was still a long way to go, that the wounds of betrayal would take time to heal, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control of his life again. And as he drove home, he knew that even though he was leaving behind a history full of hurt, he was also making room for something new, something that he still couldn't define, but that he was willing to face with courage and determination. Leonardo walked through the tree-lined streets of the new neighborhood where he had moved, feeling the freshness of the wind that seemed to wash away the last shadows of the past. The small apartment where he now lived didn't have the comforts of the home he'd left behind, but in a way, that was a relief. He felt that each bare wall, each hand-picked piece of furniture, represented a new chapter, an empty space ready to be filled with memories that he would still build. The pain of betrayal was still there, but over time it had turned into something more, a silent acceptance that some things needed to be broken to make way for others. Clara, in turn, also faced the consequences of her choices. After Leonardo left the house, she decided to stay for a while, but the loneliness was almost unbearable. Every room seemed to echo with memories of a love she herself had destroyed. Although she tried to justify her mistakes at first, she now clearly saw the impact of her actions. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of a part of herself that she believed was invincible. She began attending therapy, something she had always avoided, trying to understand the reasons behind her dissatisfaction and the choices that led to her downfall. The idea of winning Leonardo back seemed increasingly distant, but, more than that, Clara realized that she needed to win herself back first. Meanwhile, Clara's lover faced his own hell. Leonardo kept his promise to expose him, using every detail obtained from Clara to ensure that he no longer had space in the professional world he was trying to infiltrate. With his reputation ruined and connections severed, he lost his job and saw previously open doors close one by one. In a moment of desperation, he tried to confront Leonardo, believing he could intimidate him or reverse the situation, but he found an unshakable man, whose calm and firmness made it clear that there was no more room for arguments. The lover had no choice but to accept defeat, but his fall was a reminder that in a game of manipulation, the consequences can be ruthless. Leonardo, now in his new space, began to rediscover simple pleasures that he had left aside. He spent afternoons reading books that he always wanted to explore, he walked aimlessly, he discovered new places and, little by little, he allowed the world around him to surprise him. On one of these walks, he found himself in a small independent bookstore, where a friendly woman, who seemed equally fascinated by stories, offered him help. Her name was Sophia, and the meeting, although brief, left a lasting impression. She had a calmness that contrasted with the intensity of the turmoil that Leonardo had been experiencing for months, and, without realizing it, he began to frequent the bookstore more, finding a new source of relief in his conversations with Sophia. Clara also began to rebuild her life differently. She moved to a small apartment downtown, far from the house where everything had collapsed. He returned to photography with a fervor he hadn't felt in a long time, using his art as a way to process his pain and guilt. He began opening up to close friends, something he never did before, admitting his flaws and learning to be vulnerable. Little by little, he realized that the reconstruction process was long and painful, but necessary. For the first time, she felt like she was building something that didn't depend on someone else, something that was genuinely hers. As the months passed, Leonardo and Sophia began to meet outside the bookstore. Everything happened naturally, without rushing, without overwhelming expectations. Sophia didn't ask questions about Leonardo's past, but she also didn't avoid him when he wanted to share. Little by little, he felt himself opening up again, allowing someone into his life without carrying the weight of what had happened. Sophia, with her patience and understanding, brought a lightness that he thought he had lost forever. Clara, on the other hand, had the opportunity to talk to Leonardo one last time, months after the separation. She met him by chance at an art exhibition, where they were both admiring the same photograph. For a moment there was an awkward silence, but then Clara came over and said she was happy to see him well. Leonardo, with a discreet smile, replied that he was finding his way. They spoke briefly, without hurt feelings, without accusations. Clara thanked him for everything he had represented in her life and apologized once again, not expecting forgiveness, but wanting to close that chapter honestly. Leonardo, although he didn't say he forgave her, acknowledged that they were both finally moving on. Clara's lover, now isolated and without the resources he previously used to manipulate situations, disappeared from the social and professional circle where he was previously known. His fall was a cruel reminder that actions have consequences, and he lived with the shadow of his own mistakes, unable to rebuild what he had destroyed. Leonardo and Sophia eventually began a relationship. It wasn't a fairy tale, both carried scars, both had stories that shaped them. But together, they found a way to create something authentic, based on respect and understanding. Sophia brought a new perspective to Leonardo's life, a new chance to believe that love could be built with patience and honesty. Clara continued to grow, finding in photography a way to connect with other people and with herself. His art, once focused on capturing perfect moments, now explored human imperfections, pain and redemption. She never found another love like the one she had with Leonardo, but she found something equally valuable, the ability to forgive herself and move on. Leonardo, in turn, looked at the past without regret, but with a calm acceptance that some things needed to be experienced so that he could become the person he was now. He knew that not everything had ended as he had hoped, but he also knew that he had found a new beginning, something that filled him with hope. And now, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments, it is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Remembering, our channel does not support any type of betrayal in any way. Until next time.